Think about the greatest empires in history, and your mind probably fills with images of gleaming swords, towering castles, and armies clashing on battlefields. But what if I told you that some of the most powerful forces in the medieval world were not made of steel, but of something far more subtle and enduring? Close your eyes for a moment and picture a quiet, candlelit room where the only sounds are the gentle scratching of a quill and the soft rustle of animal skin. Here, far from the chaos of war, something remarkable is taking place: the careful, deliberate act of writing. This is where real power was being crafted, not with the swing of a sword, but with the stroke of a pen. In an age defined by violence and conquest, it was the humble scroll, that unassuming piece of parchment, that quietly shaped civilizations, preserved the wisdom of ages, and dictated the course of human events in ways that still echo today. We often remember the Middle Ages for its kings and knights, its epic battles and grand cathedrals, but behind all that spectacle lay a quieter, deeper revolution, one built on networks of scribes, scholars, and sacred spaces called Scriptoria. These were the true architects of what we might call Parchment Empires, vast and intricate systems of knowledge and administration that wielded more influence than any army ever could. While swords could conquer lands, it was scrolls that governed them, that recorded laws, that spread ideas, and that connected people across continents and centuries. Parchment became the silent engine of medieval life, enabling everything from royal decrees and international treaties to the preservation of philosophy, science, and faith. It was durable, reusable, and incredibly versatile, an innovation so profound that it helped transform Europe from a fractured collection of warring tribes into a continent with shared laws, languages, and dreams. So today, we're setting out on a journey to uncover the untold story of how scrolls outlasted swords and literally forged the foundations of the modern world. We'll explore how monks huddled over desks saved classical knowledge from being lost forever, how scribes turned oral promises into binding contracts that built feudal societies, and how something as simple as animal hide could carry ideas powerful enough to challenge kings and shape cultures. This is a tale of unsung heroes, of patient hands and brilliant minds who understood that words, carefully written and preserved, could change everything. It's about the unexpected tools that built empires not with force, but with memory, meaning, and the relentless human desire to make things last. So settle in, open your imagination, and let's step back into a time when the future was being written, one precious page at a time. But to truly grasp the power of this material, we need to understand its origin story, a tale not of royal courts or battlefields, but of workshops and tanneries. The journey from a simple animal hide to a pristine sheet of parchment was a complex and demanding craft, one that required immense patience and skill. It typically began with the skin of a calf, sheep, or goat, animals widely available across medieval Europe. These skins were first thoroughly washed to remove dirt and then soaked in a lime solution for several days. This crucial step loosened the hair and fat, making it easier to scrape them away. After this soaking, the wet skin was stretched taut onto a wooden frame called a hearse, where the real transformation began. Using a special crescent-shaped knife with a handle on both ends, a craftsman known as a parchmenter would meticulously scrape both sides of the stretched skin. This process removed every last trace of hair and flesh, thinning the hide uniformly. The stretching was vital. It ensured the skin dried under tension, resulting in a smooth, firm writing surface. As it dried on the frame, the parchmenter would constantly adjust the tension and continue scraping, sometimes even using pumice stone to achieve a perfectly fine, velvety finish. The final product was a thin, strong, and incredibly durable sheet, ready to be cut, ruled, and inscribed. This wasn't a quick job. Creating a single high-quality sheet was a days-long endeavor, which immediately explains why parchment was such a valuable commodity. Its superiority over older materials like papyrus was undeniable. Papyrus, made from the pith of a Nile reed, was cheaper and easier to produce, but it was brittle and fared poorly in the damp, cool climates of northern Europe. It cracked along its folds and could be destroyed by moisture. Parchment, by contrast, was remarkably resilient. It could be rolled, folded, and even written on both sides. If a scribe made a mistake or a text was no longer needed, the surface could be scraped clean and reused, creating what we call a palimpsest, a manuscript with layers of writing, one hidden beneath another. This durability made it the perfect medium for documents that needed to last, land charters that proved ownership for generations, royal decrees that carried the force of law across a kingdom, and sacred religious texts that were meant to be passed down through the centuries. This wasn't a craft practiced in every village. The production of parchment required reliable access to large numbers of animal skins, vats of lime, and specialized tools, meaning it was often centered in specific locations. Monastic communities, with their self-sufficient economies and large agricultural holdings, became major centers of production. They had a constant supply of skins from their own herds and the dedicated labor force to undertake the painstaking process. Similarly, royal workshops in growing urban centers employed skilled parchmenters to meet the insatiable demand of a burgeoning bureaucracy. The very act of producing parchment, therefore, became intertwined with centers of power, both spiritual and secular. It was this unassuming material, born from a messy, physical process, that would become the silent, non-violent engine of administration, allowing kings to govern distant provinces and the church to maintain its doctrinal unity across a continent. Now imagine stepping inside one of those monastic workshops, a place far removed from the noise and grime of the outside world. This is the Scriptorium, the very heart of the Parchment Empire. It was here, in these hushed, hallowed halls, that the raw material of animal skin was transformed into something far more powerful: permanent knowledge. Picture a large, often chilly room, lined with wooden desks called carrels. Each monk had his own space, a small island of focus equipped with a meticulously organized set of tools: a sharp quill from a goose or swan feather, knives for cutting and sharpening, pots of ink made from soot or gallnuts, and of course, those precious, blank sheets of parchment. The air might be thick with the scent of ink, wax, and the faint, lingering smell of the animal hide itself. This wasn't a library for quiet reading. This was a factory floor for the production of information, a bustling intellectual workshop where the primary machinery was the human hand and eye. The work was grueling, a test of both physical endurance and spiritual devotion. A monk might spend an entire day, from dawn until the light faded, hunched over a single page, his back aching and eyes straining. Every letter, every word had to be perfectly formed. There was no delete key, no easy way to correct a major error. A single mistake could mean hours of work lost, forcing the scribe to carefully scrape the ink from the parchment, or, in some cases, begin the entire page again. This immense pressure demanded a unique combination of skills: the steady hand of an artist, the keen eye of a proofreader, and the patient soul of a devoted scholar. It was a form of prayer in action, a meditation through manual labor. The very act of copying was seen as a holy duty, a way of spreading the divine word and preserving the wisdom of the ancients for future generations. Their work guaranteed that the ideas of Aristotle, the poems of Virgil, and the laws of Rome would not vanish into the fog of history. Perhaps their most revolutionary contribution was the development of a common language for writing itself. Before the scriptorium system became widespread, Europe was a tangled mess of regional scripts. What passed for writing in one monastery might be nearly illegible in another, a chaotic collection of elaborate, cramped, and inconsistent letter forms. This changed dramatically under the rule of Charlemagne and his advisor, the scholar Alcuin of York. They initiated a cultural revival now known as the Carolingian Renaissance, and a key part of this project was standardizing handwriting. The monks in the Scriptoria perfected a new script called Carolingian minuscule. This was a game changer. It featured clear, separated lowercase letters, consistent spacing between words, and the humble yet revolutionary invention of punctuation. For the first time, a text written in France could be easily read and understood in Germany or Italy. This wasn't just an aesthetic improvement. It was a massive leap forward in communication technology, creating a unified information network across a fractured continent. Through this relentless, dedicated labor, the Scriptoria became the ultimate instruments of soft power. Every beautifully copied Bible reinforced the theological authority of the Church, presenting a unified doctrine to the faithful. But their influence extended far beyond the altar. These monasteries were also copying and creating legal texts, historical chronicles, and works on agriculture, medicine, and astronomy. A king seeking to legitimize his rule or administer his lands effectively needed these documents. He relied on the monastic network to produce the charters, decrees, and records that were the backbone of medieval governance. In this way, the quiet monk in his carrel held a form of influence that many a shouting baron would envy. He wasn't just preserving old books, he was actively shaping the intellectual and political landscape of his time, making the Scriptorium one of the most potent powerhouses the world has ever seen. Yet for all their importance, the daily reality for a scribe was far from glamorous. Imagine the physical toll of this work. A scribe spent countless hours in a fixed, hunched position, often in dimly lit rooms heated only by a small brazier. Their primary light source was a narrow window or a flickering candle or oil lamp, which not only strained their eyes but also posed a constant fire risk to their precious materials. The tools of their trade were simple but required constant maintenance. The quill, usually from a goose feather, needed to be constantly sharpened with a special knife, a task so central to the job that this knife became one of the scribe's most personal possessions. The inks they used were handmade, from soot mixed with gum arabic for a rich black, or from crushed minerals for colors like red and blue. A sudden sneeze, a wobbly desk, or a moment of distraction could lead to a catastrophic ink blot, ruining hours of meticulous labor and forcing them to either painstakingly scrape the parchment clean or, in the worst cases, start the entire sheet over again. This was a life of intense discipline, where a steady hand and an even steadier temperament were the most valuable assets. Their expertise went far beyond mere penmanship. It was a form of highly specialized legal and linguistic coding. To save precious space on expensive parchment, scribes employed a complex system of abbreviations, a kind of medieval shorthand that was essential for drafting lengthy legal documents. They had to master specific formulae, set phrases, and ceremonial language that gave a charter or a will its legal force. A land grant from a king, for instance, wasn't just a simple note. It was a rigidly structured text that had to include the ruler's full title, a list of witnesses, a precise description of the land being transferred, and the specific conditions of the grant. Omitting a single customary phrase like "to have" and "to hold" could potentially render the entire document invalid in a dispute. The scribe was the guardian of this formal language, the technician who ensured that the spoken will of a lord was translated into an unassailable written record. Their deep understanding of these legal conventions made them indispensable advisors, often stepping beyond the role of mere writer to become a draftsman of the law itself. And while we often picture monks when we think of scribes, a vast number were secular professionals working in the bustling heart of medieval towns. These were not monks seeking spiritual fulfillment through labor, but skilled artisans plying a trade. They might be employed in a royal chancery, a noble household, or they might work independently, setting up a small shop near a cathedral or a marketplace, offering their services to anyone who could pay. A merchant needing a contract drawn up for a shipment of wool, a wealthy widow dictating her last will and testament, a town council requiring an official record of its proceedings, all would seek out the local scribe. Their fees, while modest compared to the wealth of their clients, represented a crucial investment in certainty and permanence. This commercial aspect of their work highlights just how deeply the written word had penetrated all levels of society, creating a class of literate professionals who facilitated everything from international trade to the most personal family matters. The true measure of their impact, however, lies in the systems they built and maintained. Think of a medieval king trying to govern his realm without a scribble class. How could he collect taxes without written rolls listing landowners and their obligations? How could he resolve a border dispute between two powerful barons without a sealed charter to prove who owned what? How could his laws be applied consistently across his kingdom if they were only transmitted by word of mouth, vulnerable to forgetfulness and manipulation? The scribe provided the answer to all these questions. They created the tangible, durable evidence of authority and agreement. Every tax record, every court judgment, every royal proclamation that was written down and stored in an archive became a brick in the foundation of the state. This silent, cumulative labor of thousands of nameless scribes, generation after generation, slowly built the administrative frameworks that allowed governments to become more centralized, more efficient, and more powerful. They were the human infrastructure that turned the vague concept of a kingdom into a governable reality, proving that the pen, carefully wielded by a trained hand, was indeed mightier than the sword. So if the scribes were the architects of this system, then the legal documents they produced were the unshakable foundations upon which feudal power was built. Think about the very essence of feudalism, a complex web of personal obligations and loyalties between a lord and his vassals. A knight would pledge his military service in exchange for a parcel of land, but how was that promise enforced across generations? A spoken vow, witnessed by a few, could be forgotten, misremembered, or outright denied by a successor. But a land charter, written on a durable sheet of parchment and sealed with the Lord's distinct wax emblem, transformed that fleeting verbal agreement into a permanent, tangible fact. It was physical proof that could be pulled from a chest, unrolled, and read aloud to settle any dispute. This document didn't just record the transaction, it was the transaction. It gave the new owner a sense of permanence and legitimacy that a handshake alone could never provide, effectively cementing the entire social hierarchy into place by making land ownership the primary source of wealth and power, a matter of official record. The design of these charters and decrees was itself a form of security theater and a display of authority. They were often magnificent objects, far more than just blocks of text. Scribes would use elaborate, intimidating scripts for the opening lines, known as the invocation and the royal intitulation, which listed all the grand titles of the king or lord issuing the grant. The most important documents were chartered, meaning they were written in a larger, more formal script than everyday records, but the most powerful anti-forgery device was the seal. Attached by a cord or strip of parchment dangling from the bottom of the document, the wax seal bore the unique imprint of the owner's signet ring. To forge a seal was a serious crime, often punishable by death, because it was akin to stealing the very identity and authority of the ruler. The wax itself could be examined for tampering, and the intricate design, a knight on horseback, a heraldic animal, a portrait of the king, was incredibly difficult to replicate accurately. This combination of imposing script, standardized legal language, and physical authentication made these parchments incredibly trustworthy, allowing them to function as the bedrock of law and commerce. Perhaps the ultimate example of this administrative power is the Domesday Book, commissioned by William the Conqueror in 1086. Just 20 years after his victory at Hastings, William faced the enormous task of consolidating his control over a conquered and often rebellious England. His solution was breathtakingly ambitious, a comprehensive kingdom-wide survey of virtually every piece of property and every resource in the land. Royal officials fanned out across the country, holding local inquiries in every village and shire, demanding to know who held what land, how many peasants worked it, how many plows were there, how many mills, meadows, and woods. This mountain of information was then compiled, organized, and meticulously written down onto parchment pages that were later bound into 2 great volumes. The result was a detailed snapshot of 11th century England, so precise and so valuable that it was nicknamed Domesday by the English people themselves, because its judgments, like those of the Last Judgment, were final and could not be appealed. The Domesday Book was the ultimate tool for centralized control. For William and his Norman barons, it was a detailed guide to the wealth of their new kingdom, allowing them to efficiently tax that wealth and quash any disputes over land ownership before they could even begin. If a local nobleman challenged the king's right to a piece of land, the officials could simply consult the book. Its authority was absolute. It represented a revolutionary idea that knowledge, systematically collected and permanently recorded, was a more powerful tool for governance than sheer military force alone. William had conquered England with swords, but he ruled it with parchment. This massive project demonstrated to every other ruler in Europe the incredible potential of written records to impose order, extract revenue, and project royal power into every corner of a realm, setting a new standard for what a centralized state could achieve. But this administrative revolution needed a cultural one to truly take root, and that brings us to one of the most pivotal moments in the story of parchment, the Carolingian Renaissance. Imagine a Europe still reeling from the collapse of Rome, a patchwork of warring kingdoms where local dialects were splintering Latin into dozens of new languages, and where the very art of reading and writing was fading into a specialized, almost forgotten craft. Into this world stepped a ruler who understood that to build a lasting empire, he needed more than just loyal soldiers. He needed a unified culture, and that culture would be built on the written word. Charlemagne, crowned emperor of the Romans on Christmas Day in the year 800, possessed a vision that was breathtaking in its scope. He sought to unify his vast territories stretching from modern-day France deep into Germany and Italy, not merely through military conquest, but through a shared intellectual and religious revival. He recognized that to administer such a diverse realm effectively, he needed a class of educated officials who could read his decrees, write accurate reports, and maintain consistent records. And to do that, he needed to standardize the very tools of communication itself. At the heart of this project was a brilliant scholar from York named Alcuin, whom Charlemagne invited to his court to lead this educational overhaul. Alcuin's mission was clear: to reform handwriting, purify the Latin language, and supercharge the production of accurate texts. The problem he faced was a mess of regional scripts. A document written in a monastery in Lombardy might be completely illegible to a scribe in Aachen. Letters were often cramped, uneven, and run together without spaces, making reading a slow, laborious process of decipherment rather than comprehension. Alcuin and the scribes under his direction developed a new, elegant script that would become the hallmark of this Renaissance, Carolingian minuscule. Its genius was in its stunning clarity. It featured distinct, rounded lowercase letters, consistent spacing between words, and the systematic use of punctuation and capitalization to mark the beginnings of sentences and proper nouns. For the first time, a text could be read quickly and accurately by anyone trained in the script, dramatically reducing errors in copying and misunderstanding in communication. This wasn't just a new font, it was a revolutionary operating system for the medieval mind, creating a common visual language that could bind an empire together. This new script became the vehicle for an unprecedented campaign of text production. Charlemagne issued a series of decrees or capitularies, urging the establishment of schools in every monastery and bishopric across his realm. These schools were to teach not only future priests but also the sons of nobles, the future administrators of the empire, using a standardized curriculum based on the 7 liberal arts. The Scriptoria we discussed earlier went into overdrive, but now with a new sense of purpose and uniformity. They were tasked with creating pristine copies of key texts, the Bible, of course, but also the works of the Church Fathers and, crucially, the surviving literature of Roman antiquity. Monks now copied the works of Virgil, Cicero, and Ovid in the clean, legible lines of Carolingian minuscule, rescuing these classical texts from the obscurity of difficult-to-read older scripts and ensuring their survival for future generations. Each beautifully produced book was a testament to the empire's cultural sophistication and a tool for spreading its unified vision. The impact of this investment was profound and multifaceted. Politically, it gave Charlemagne and his successors a powerful tool for control. A law written in standardized minuscule could be disseminated and understood from one end of the empire to the other, ensuring that royal commands were executed consistently. Administratively, it created a burgeoning class of literate laymen who could staff the royal chancery, keeping the detailed records of grants, taxes, and legal proceedings that are the lifeblood of any state. But perhaps most importantly, culturally, it established a benchmark for quality and clarity that would endure for centuries. Even after the Carolingian Empire itself fractured, the script did not. It became the preferred style for writing across Western Europe, and its influence is literally right in front of you today. When Italian Renaissance scholars of the 14th and 15th centuries looked back to recover classical learning, they found it preserved in Carolingian manuscripts, and they modeled their own humanist scripts on its elegant forms. These Renaissance scripts were later adapted by early printers into the typefaces that evolved into the very letters you are reading now on your screen. The ghost of Carolingian minuscule, born from a king's desire to rule more effectively, lives on in every modern book, website, and document, a silent but enduring legacy of how an investment in knowledge can truly shape the future. But the Carolingian project wasn't just about clarity and administration. It was also about creating objects of breathtaking beauty that could inspire devotion and project power in a way that plain text simply could not. This is where the art of illumination truly came into its own, transforming functional books into radiant treasures. Imagine a monk, having spent weeks carefully copying the sacred text in flawless minuscule, now preparing to elevate his work from a mere document to a divine experience. His toolkit expands to include brushes fine enough for a single hair, pots of pigment ground from precious minerals, lapis lazuli for a celestial blue that had to be imported from distant Afghanistan, malachite for green, cinnabar for a vibrant red, and most dazzling of all, delicate sheets of beaten gold leaf. The process of applying this gold, known as burnishing, was a form of magic. The parchment was first prepared with a sticky substance-like bowl, a red clay, and then the infinitesimally thin sheet of gold was laid down. Using a smooth stone or even a tooth, the artist would polish it until it shone with a brilliant, warm light that seemed to come from within the page itself. This wasn't just decoration, it was a deliberate attempt to capture the light of heaven, to make the Word of God literally glow with divine radiance. These illuminated manuscripts served a dual purpose, functioning as both sacred objects and powerful instruments of propaganda. For the Church, a lavishly decorated gospel book was a focal point for worship, its beauty intended to direct the viewer's mind toward the glory of God. The intricate illustrations, known as miniatures, did more than just beautify the page, they acted as a visual sermon. For the vast majority of congregants who could not read the Latin text, these images narrated the stories of the Bible in a language everyone could understand. A depiction of the crucifixion could evoke profound empathy, while a triumphant image of Christ in majesty could reinforce the Church's ultimate authority. But this display of wealth and artistry also sent a very secular message. When a king or a powerful bishop commissioned such a book, they were making a bold statement about their own piety, their cultural refinement, and their immense resources. The sheer cost of the materials, the gold, the rare pigments, the countless hours of highly skilled labor was astronomical. Owning, or better yet, donating, such a masterpiece to a monastery was a calculated act of patronage that boosted the donor's status and ensured their name would be remembered in the prayers of the grateful monks. The book itself became a symbol of their power, a permanent and portable testament to their role as a defender of the faith and a patron of the arts. Two of the most stunning examples of this fusion are the Book of Kells and the Lindisfarne Gospels, both created in isolated monastic communities on the very edges of the known world. The Book of Kells, likely begun on the island of Iona and finished in Ireland, is renowned for its mind-bendingly intricate ornamentation. Its pages are alive with a vibrant chaos of Celtic knots, spirals, and interlaced animals so complex that modern scholars debate how the human hand could have possibly executed them without the aid of magnification. The text itself often becomes secondary to the decoration, with letters morphing into serpents or the bodies of saints. It is a work of overwhelming visual intensity, designed to inspire awe and symbolize the boundless complexity of God's creation. The Lindisfarne Gospels, created in a monastery off the northeast coast of England, display a different but equally masterful synthesis of styles. Here, the Celtic love of intricate pattern meets the Mediterranean tradition of figurative representation. The carpet pages are pure abstract marvels, woven patterns of color and line that seem to vibrate with energy, while the portraits of the evangelists are rendered with a classical sense of form and drapery. This blending of artistic traditions from across Britain and Europe shows how these remote centers of learning were, in fact, connected to a wider world of ideas, using the universal language of art to create a uniquely powerful religious experience. This artistic investment fundamentally elevated the status of the written word. A plain text could inform, but an illuminated manuscript could captivate, persuade, and humble. It commanded respect and reverence, transforming reading from a simple act of decoding words into a multi-sensory engagement with beauty and sanctity. The physical book became a relic in its own right, an object to be handled with care, displayed on altars, and carried in processions. This fusion of aesthetics and information ensured that the messages contained within, whether they were passages from scripture, records of royal genealogy, or texts of law, were imbued with an aura of unquestionable authority and timelessness. The beauty of the object lent credence to the truth of its words, making the illuminated manuscript one of the most sophisticated and effective tools for shaping belief and reinforcing power in the medieval world. And so these magnificent illuminated manuscripts, glowing with gold and vibrant color, became more than just beautiful objects locked away in treasure chests. They became passports for ideas, traveling across continents and through centuries. Picture a dusty trade caravan slowly making its way along the Silk Road, its bundles of silks and spices hiding something even more precious, a carefully wrapped parcel of parchment scrolls. Or imagine a Christian pilgrim returning from a long journey to Jerusalem, carrying not just relics but also new philosophical texts acquired in a bustling Mediterranean port. Even a diplomatic envoy traveling between the court of a French king and a Muslim caliph in Spain would exchange gifts that included beautifully crafted books. These were the unlikely couriers of cultural revolution, and their cargo of knowledge inscribed on durable parchment was about to reshape the entire intellectual landscape of Europe. The very resilience of the material meant that these texts could survive the long, arduous journeys over mountains and across seas, arriving intact to be studied, copied, and debated in centers of learning thousands of miles from their origin. Nowhere was this exchange more transformative than in the vibrant, multicultural cities of medieval Spain, particularly in Toledo. After Christian forces recaptured the city in the 11th century, they discovered a treasure trove that had been preserved and expanded by Muslim and Jewish scholars, a vast library of scientific and philosophical works, many of which were Arabic translations and commentaries on ancient Greek thinkers that had been lost to Western Europe for centuries. Eager to access this knowledge, bishops and kings sponsored a massive translation movement, gathering teams of Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars who worked side by side in a remarkable collaboration. They would translate these texts from Arabic into Castilian Spanish, and then from Spanish into the Latin that was the common language of European scholars. The physical medium for this entire endeavor was, of course, parchment. Scribes meticulously copied the translated works, ensuring that the recovered wisdom of Aristotle, Ptolemy, Euclid, and Galen on topics from logic and astronomy to medicine and optics could now spread across the continent. This wasn't a slow trickle of information. It was an intellectual tsunami, fundamentally challenging and eventually overhauling the foundations of European thought. The institutions that received and propagated these new old ideas were the very nodes of this emerging knowledge network, the monasteries and the newly founded universities. A university like the one in Bologna or Paris functioned much like a modern startup hub, buzzing with energy and debate. At its core was the stationarius, a licensed bookseller who operated under strict university regulations. His workshop was a crucial link in the chain. He would borrow an authorized copy of a key text, perhaps Aristotle's Physics freshly translated from Arabic, and break it down into separate sections called pisci, which means pieces. These individual quires of parchment would then be rented out to different students, who could each hire their own scribe to copy their assigned sections simultaneously. This assembly line method drastically sped up production, making multiple copies of dense philosophical works available to a hungry student body at a much faster rate than any monastic scriptorium could achieve on its own. The university itself became a powerful engine for the replication and dissemination of knowledge, all running on parchment. This incredible flow of information, made possible by the physical portability and durability of parchment, directly fueled what historians call the 12th century Renaissance. It was a period of explosive intellectual fervor. For the first time in centuries, European scholars had access to a complete system of logic and natural philosophy from Aristotle, sophisticated medical texts from physicians like Avicenna, and advanced mathematics from Arabic scholars, including the numerical system we use today. This new learning didn't just add to existing knowledge, it created profound tension and excitement. The rigorous logical methods of Aristotle challenged theologians to reconcile faith with reason, leading to the development of scholasticism, a new way of learning that prized debate, disputation, and systematic questioning. Great thinkers like Peter Abelard and Thomas Aquinas didn't just accept these new ideas, they wrestled with them, wrote extensive commentaries on parchment quires, and used them to build vast, comprehensive systems of thought that would dominate universities for generations. This entire intellectual revolution, which laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution centuries later, was quite literally built on the thousands of parchment pages that traveled, were translated, and were tirelessly copied across Europe. This cross-cultural dialogue, facilitated by the humble scroll and codex, reminds us that the medieval world was far from a static backwater. It was a dynamic, interconnected sphere where ideas moved as freely as goods, if not more so. A single parchment manuscript could begin its life in a Baghdad library, be studied by a Jewish scholar in Cordoba, translated by a team in Toledo, copied by a scribe in Paris, and finally debated by a student in Oxford. Each time it was copied, it wasn't just duplicated. It was often annotated, glossed, and interpreted, with layers of commentary building upon the original text like a centuries-long conversation. Parchment was the stable, durable platform that made this long-distance, cross-generational conversation possible. It allowed for the preservation of nuance and complexity in a way that oral transmission never could, ensuring that the full richness of a philosophical argument or a scientific observation could be transmitted across vast distances of space and time. This ability to carry complex ideas intact is what ultimately allowed Europe to rediscover its own classical past through the careful stewardship and intellectual advancements of other cultures, demonstrating that the most powerful wars are not always fought over land, but over ideas, and the most enduring victories are won not with the sword, but with the pen. Now, let's shift our focus from the grand intellectual exchanges to the bustling marketplaces and counting houses where parchment proved its worth in a far more immediate sense, the world of commerce. While philosophers debated Aristotle in university halls, merchants and bankers were engaged in their own practical revolution, one built on trust, credit, and meticulous record-keeping. Their most essential tool wasn't the abacus but the ledger. Imagine a merchant in a crowded 14th century trade hub like Bruges or Venice. His business doesn't run on coins jingling in a purse. It runs on promises, debts, and complex agreements stretching across months and miles. He has just sold a shipment of English wool to a clothmaker in Florence, but he won't see actual payment for half a year. How can he be sure he'll be paid? The entire system relies on his ability to produce a written contract, a bill of exchange, or an entry in his account book that meticulously records the transaction. That piece of parchment, signed and sealed, is more valuable than a chest of silver in that moment. It is a legally binding promise, a piece of future wealth made tangible and secure. Without this simple technology, the intricate web of long-distance trade that fueled the medieval economy would have simply collapsed under the weight of suspicion and forgotten details. This written evidence was the bedrock of trust in a world where most business was conducted between strangers who might never meet again. A merchant couldn't rely on the old feudal bonds of personal loyalty. His partners might be from a different city, a different culture, even a different religion. A spoken agreement made in a noisy tavern could be misremembered or outright denied once the ships had sailed, but a contract written on parchment changed everything. It created a fixed, unchanging record that could be presented to a guild court or a city magistrate if a dispute arose. The very act of writing it down forced clarity upon the terms, the quality and quantity of the goods, the exact price, the date and place of delivery, the currency to be used for payment. This dramatically reduced opportunities for fraud and misunderstanding. It also enabled the sophisticated use of credit, the true lifeblood of expanding commerce. A merchant could buy goods now based on the promise of future payment recorded in a bill of exchange, which was essentially a medieval check, a written order from the issuer to an agent in another city to pay a specific sum to the bearer on a certain date. This allowed capital to flow and goods to move without the enormous risk and inconvenience of transporting vast quantities of coinage across dangerous roads and pirate-infested seas. One of the most powerful examples of this system in action was the Hanseatic League, a vast commercial and defensive confederation of merchant guilds and market towns that dominated trade in northern Europe from the 13th to the 15th centuries. Stretching from London in the west to Novgorod in the east, the Hanseatic network was far too extensive to be managed by any single ruler or through personal relationships. Its cohesion depended entirely on written agreements meticulously maintained on parchment. The League's contours or trading posts in cities like Bruges, Bergen, and London operated under detailed written charters that spelled out the privileges and obligations of the Hanse merchants. They kept exhaustive customs records, logs of ship arrivals and departures, and minutes of their meetings, all ensuring that business was conducted uniformly and disputes were resolved according to a common set of rules. A merchant from Cologne could travel to the contour in Novgorod and operate under the same legal and commercial framework, his rights and responsibilities guaranteed by the written word. This bureaucratic backbone, all inscribed on durable parchment, is what allowed the Hanseatic League to function as a formidable economic and even political power for centuries, demonstrating that the pen could build networks just as powerful as any empire built by the sword. The practical advantage of parchment in this context cannot be overstated. Unlike paper, which was beginning to appear but was still prone to tearing and water damage, parchment ledgers could withstand the rough and tumble of life in a merchant's pack, the damp conditions aboard a ship, and years of frequent referencing. A financial record wasn't just for a single transaction, it was part of an ongoing archive. A merchant would need to look back years or even decades to settle an inheritance, prove a long-standing business relationship, or calculate compound interest on a long-term loan. The incredible durability of parchment meant that these archives became a form of institutional memory for families and firms. This ability to preserve financial data over the long term was absolutely critical for the emergence of more sophisticated capitalist practices. It allowed for the careful tracking of profit and loss over time, the assessment of risk based on past ventures, and the accumulation of detailed knowledge about markets and commodities. The quiet, cumulative work of thousands of anonymous scribes, recording the mundane details of countless transactions, was slowly building the data infrastructure that would eventually support double-entry bookkeeping, joint stock companies, and the entire edifice of modern finance. In the most literal sense, the wealth of nations was being built one carefully inscribed parchment page at a time. But beyond the grand ledgers of merchants and the philosophical texts of scholars, parchment played an equally vital role in the most intimate spheres of life, the family and the local community. In a world without photography, national archives, or digital footprints, your very identity, Your place in the world, your rights, your history, was a fragile thing, vulnerable to fading memories and conflicting claims. Parchment became the anchor for this identity, providing a permanent, unchanging record that could outlast any single human life. For a medieval family, the most crucial document they might own was not a treasure chest of jewels, but a simple will or a carefully preserved charter proving their ownership of a specific piece of land. This wasn't just a legal formality, it was the family's foundational story written down, a tangible promise that their name and their legacy would continue. In an era of high mortality, where disease or violence could strike a household down without warning, a will provided a crucial measure of control from beyond the grave, dictating how property was to be divided and ensuring that surviving children and a widow were provided for according to the deceased's wishes. This piece of parchment prevented familial chaos, turning grief-stricken confusion into orderly transition and protecting the hard-won wealth of a lifetime from being lost to squabbles or opportunistic neighbors. On a larger scale, the collective memory of an entire village or town was woven together through the chronicles kept by the local monastic house or parish church. These were not dry histories written for some distant future. They were living documents that captured the rhythm and the trauma of daily life. A monk would meticulously record the events that defined a community's shared experience. The year the harvest failed and the Great Famine began, the summer a fire swept through half the town, the glorious day the new church bell was consecrated, or even the unexpected visit of a traveling king. These entries, written in the moment, transformed fleeting local gossip into permanent history. For a community, this chronicle was their story. It explained why a certain field was considered cursed. It commemorated the generosity of a long-dead benefactor whose donation still funded the parish poor, and it gave a shared timeline that every member, from the lord of the manor to the lowliest serf, could point to as their own. In times of dispute, such as a conflict over water rights or grazing boundaries between two villages, these chronicles could be consulted to see what the arrangement had been in the time of our grandfathers, using the written word to settle arguments that oral tradition had failed to resolve. This function was perhaps most powerfully felt by those whose identities were most precarious: travelers, migrants, and those living under foreign rule. For a Jewish community in medieval Europe, for instance, constantly facing persecution and expulsion, their meticulously kept internal records written on parchment and stored in their synagogue's ark were a lifeline. These registers of births, marriages, and deaths written in Hebrew were not merely administrative, they were a defiant act of self-preservation. When a decree of expulsion forced a community to pack their belongings and move on, these scrolls were among their most precious possessions. They carried their history with them, a portable homeland made of words and animal skin that proved their continuity as a people despite having no land to call their own. Similarly, for a Saxon family living in England after the Norman conquest, an old Anglo-Saxon land charter written in a forgotten script was more than an antique. It was proof of their ancestors' rightful ownership, a fragile shield against the claims of the new Norman lords. By presenting such a document to a court, they were asserting a legal identity that predated the conquest itself, using the power of the written word to resist cultural erasure. Ultimately, these documents, the will, the genealogy, the local chronicle, did more than just record facts. They created a web of belonging. They connected an individual to their ancestors and obligated them to their descendants. They bound a community together with a shared narrative of trials and triumphs. They turned a collection of people living in proximity into a cohesive society with a past, a present, and a future. The physicality of the parchment itself added to this power. A family charter would be stored in a chest with other precious objects, handled with reverence, and brought out on important occasions to be read aloud, its words literally giving voice to the ancestors. This ritual reinforced social bonds and reminded everyone of their place within a continuum that was far larger than themselves. In this way, parchment became the medium for immortality, not for individuals, but for families, communities, and the very idea of a shared identity that could withstand the relentless passage of time. Yet for all its incredible utility and beauty, parchment had a profound and often overlooked dark side. It was a luxury product built on a foundation of immense cost and staggering resource consumption. To truly appreciate its role in medieval society, we must confront its limitations, starting with the sobering reality of its production. The journey from a living animal to a pristine writing surface was not just a craft, it was an industry of scale that required a constant and immense supply of raw materials. The best quality parchment, known as vellum, came from the skins of very young, often stillborn calves. These skins were prized for their unparalleled thinness, smoothness, and creamy white color. But for everyday use, the skins of sheep and goats were far more common. This created a direct and gruesome link between the written word and the agricultural economy. A single large Bible, like the famous Codex Amiatinus, required the skins of an estimated 500 calves. To produce that one book meant an entire herd had to be raised, slaughtered, and processed. This wasn't a casual byproduct of the meat industry. In many cases, animals were specifically raised and culled for their skins, making parchment production a significant driver of agricultural practices and a constant drain on local resources. The financial implications of this process were enormous, effectively placing a towering economic barrier between the written word and the vast majority of the population. The cost wasn't just in the animals themselves. The production process was a marathon of specialized, skilled labor. The parchment maker needed a steady supply of lime for the soaking vats, ample fresh water for washing, and a dedicated space with multiple stretching frames. All of this investment of time, materials, and expertise was baked into the final price of a single sheet. For context, the cost of a parchment book in the Middle Ages could be equivalent to the price of a small farm or a soldier's entire armor set. This meant that owning books was the exclusive domain of the incredibly wealthy kings, high-ranking clergy, and the most successful merchant princes. For an ordinary peasant or even a minor knight, a book was an almost unimaginable luxury, something they might only see if it was displayed in a church, forever out of their reach. This economic reality turned knowledge into a form of capital, a tangible asset that could be accumulated and displayed to demonstrate status and power, much like owning land or a castle. This scarcity led to a fascinating and, for historians, sometimes heartbreaking practice, the creation of palimpsests. The word itself comes from the Greek for scraped again, and it was a direct result of parchment's high value. When a text was deemed obsolete, unimportant, or perhaps heretical, it wasn't simply thrown away. Instead, the precious writing surface was recycled. The original ink was painstakingly scraped or washed away using pumice stone and mild acid, a process that inevitably left faint ghosts of the older writing beneath the surface. The sheet was then reused for a new text, which was almost always something more immediately valuable or doctrinally acceptable to the current owners. For centuries, this was seen as a practical, economical solution, but to modern scholars, palimpsests are tantalizing time capsules. Using advanced imaging technology like multi-spectral photography, we can now often recover these erased texts. In doing so, we've discovered that many of these recycled manuscripts contained works that were thought to be lost forever, unique copies of ancient Greek plays, early Christian writings that challenged orthodox views and scientific treatises that had been suppressed. This practice of reuse, born from sheer necessity, inadvertently acted as a secret archive, preserving whispers of alternative ideas beneath the official texts approved by the powerful. The most profound consequence of this cost barrier was its direct impact on literacy and the control of information. In a world where the very medium for writing was prohibitively expensive, the ability to read and write became intrinsically linked to wealth and social class. Education was pointless if you couldn't afford the materials to practice. This created a self-perpetuating cycle where the elite controlled the means of knowledge production and, by extension, the narratives that shaped society. The church and the aristocracy weren't just the primary consumers of parchment, they were its gatekeepers. They decided which texts were worth copying and preserving for future generations. A classical text that challenged theological doctrine or a local history that contradicted a king's claim to land could be quietly neglected, allowed to decay, or even actively scrubbed away to make a palimpsest. The story of the Middle Ages that has come down to us is therefore inevitably skewed. It is a history written literally on the skins of animals paid for by the powerful, reflecting their concerns, their ideologies, and their version of events. The voices of the poor, the dissenting, and the marginalized were far less likely to be recorded in a durable medium and are often lost to us as a result. Despite these significant drawbacks, the immense cost, the resource intensity, the limitations on access, parchment's advantages were so compelling that it remained the dominant medium for important writing for over 1,000 years. Its durability and prestige outweighed its economic inefficiency. A royal charter on parchment was meant to last for eternity, a permanent witness to a king's grant. A liturgical gospel book was intended to be used in sacred ceremonies for centuries. For these purposes, no other available material could compete. This enduring dominance, despite its flaws, is a powerful testament to how a technology can become so deeply embedded in a culture's practices that it persists long after its limitations are apparent. It held a monopoly on authority that would only finally be broken by the combined economic pressure of paper and the revolutionary invention of the printing press. Yet for all its dominance in the halls of power, parchment was never without competition. For centuries, it shared the stage with an ancient and formidable rival, papyrus. This material, crafted from the pith of the Nile reed, was the writing surface of the pharaohs, the Roman Empire, and the early Christian Church. Its production was a marvel of ancient engineering. Strips of the reed were laid side by side, soaked, pressed, and dried into smooth, pale sheets that could be glued together into long scrolls. Papyrus was relatively cheap and quick to produce, especially in its native Egypt, and it served as the backbone of Mediterranean bureaucracy for millennia. But it had a critical weakness that ultimately limited its reach in Europe, a profound vulnerability to damp. The humid, rainy climates north of the Alps caused papyrus to quickly become brittle, moldy, and to disintegrate along its folds. A papal decree written on papyrus might arrive in a Frankish bishop's court as a crumbling, illegible mess, rendering it useless for the serious business of record-keeping that was so vital to emerging medieval states. This climatic incompatibility created a clear geographical divide, effectively reserving papyrus for the drier Mediterranean world, while the damp north turned to the animal hide solution that could withstand its weather. The real game-changer, however, arrived not from the ancient world but from the East. Paper, a technology invented in China around the 2nd century, began its long, slow journey westward through the Islamic world. Muslim artisans in Samarkand and Baghdad perfected the process, which involved creating a pulp from recycled rags, primarily linen and hemp, which was then suspended in water, sieved through a screen to form a sheet and pressed dry. This method was nothing short of revolutionary. Its raw material was cheap, abundant, and endlessly renewable compared to the finite supply of animal skins. By the 11th and 12th centuries, paper mills were operating in Islamic Spain, and from there, the knowledge trickled into Christian Europe. Initially, this new material was met with deep suspicion and even outright hostility. In 1221, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Roman II issued a decree declaring all official documents written on paper to be invalid, and as late as the 13th century, the papal chancery insisted on using parchment for its most important bulls. There was a pervasive belief that paper made from rags was inherently flimsy and ephemeral, utterly unfit for documents intended to last for eternity. But the economic argument for paper was simply too powerful to ignore. The cost difference was staggering. Producing a single sheet of parchment required the life of an animal, days of skilled labor, and a suite of expensive materials like lime. Producing a sheet of paper required a basket of old rags, water, and a simple mechanical mill. By the 14th century, the practicality of paper for everyday needs became undeniable, and paper mills began to sprout up across Italy, France, and Germany. Its use exploded in areas where permanence was not the primary concern. Merchants embraced it for day-to-day account ledgers, drafts, and correspondence. Scholars and students who could never have afforded a parchment copy of a textbook could now own multiple paper copies for note-taking and study. Writers and poets began drafting their works on paper, allowing for a more fluid and less financially ruinous creative process. It became the medium of the moment for the ephemeral, the experimental, and the economical. This led to a fascinating and pragmatic coexistence of materials throughout the late Middle Ages, a clear hierarchy based on function and prestige. Society didn't simply abandon one material for another, it assigned each to its proper station. For the most solemn, sacred, and legally binding purposes, nothing but parchment would do. A royal charter granting lands, an illuminated Bible for the high altar, a last will and testament, these were still inscribed on the durable, luxurious surface of parchment. Its very substance conveyed gravity, permanence, and authority. Paper, meanwhile, handled the bustling, messy business of growing commerce, bureaucracy, and intellectual life. A lawyer might keep his formal, final copy of a legal contract on parchment for filing with the court, but his working drafts and notes would be on paper. A university might have a beautiful parchment copy of Aristotle's works for its library, but the students would learn from cheaper paper copies. This wasn't a story of total replacement, but rather one of specialization, with medieval society wisely matching the tool to the task, using the enduring strength of parchment for its foundations and the nimble efficiency of paper for its scaffolding. This material transition reflects a much broader shift in medieval Europe, a move towards greater accessibility, efficiency, and the beginnings of a more mass-oriented culture. The rise of paper was inextricably linked to the growth of towns, trade, and a literate lay population that needed writing for practical, not just sacred, purposes. It laid the crucial groundwork for the next great revolution, the printing press, when Gutenberg sought a material to use with his movable type in the 15th century. He experimented with both parchment and paper. While he did produce some magnificent vellum copies of his Bible for wealthy patrons, it was paper that made the mass production of books economically feasible, truly democratizing knowledge in a way that parchment never could. The journey from the scriptorium to the printing press was paved with rag paper, a humble material that would eventually carry the ideas of the Reformation, the scientific revolution, and the Enlightenment to a waiting world. Yet for all the economic and bureaucratic systems built by men, the world of parchment was far from an exclusively male domain. If we listen closely, we can hear another story woven into the margins of these medieval manuscripts, a quieter, but no less powerful, narrative of women's intellectual and spiritual labor. The traditional image of the secluded, silent nun is due for a dramatic revision. Within the cloistered walls of convents across Europe, communities of women were not merely passive recipients of religious doctrine. They were active, skilled participants in the very creation of knowledge. These convents operated their own independent scriptoria, and here the familiar tools of the scribe, the quill, the knife, the precious sheets of parchment were wielded by female hands. For these women, the scriptorium was not just a workshop, it was a space of profound autonomy and intellectual expression. Freed from the expectations of marriage and motherhood, they could dedicate their lives to study, composition, and the meticulous art of copying. Their output was astonishingly diverse. They produced beautiful psalters and prayer books for their own devotional use, of course, but they also copied and preserved classical texts, works of history, and even medical treatises, ensuring this knowledge survived through the ages. The convent scriptorium became a unique sanctuary where female literacy and artistic talent were not just permitted, but actively nurtured and celebrated as a form of divine service. Some of these women transcended the role of copyists to become renowned authors and visionaries in their own right, and their works, inscribed on parchment, have echoed for centuries. The most spectacular example is Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German abbess, composer, naturalist, and theologian. Though she likely dictated her visions to a trusted male scribe, the resulting texts, magnificent, illuminated works like the Civias, are undeniably her own genius, captured for eternity on the parchment page. These were not simple devotional texts. They were complex theological works that tackled cosmology, medicine, and moral philosophy, accompanied by breathtaking illustrations that mapped her mystical experiences. Hildegard used her authority as a prophetess and the medium of the book to advise popes, emperors, and bishops, her voice carrying a weight and reach that was extraordinary for any woman of her time. She stands as a powerful testament to how parchment could serve as a megaphone for a female intellectual, allowing her to project her ideas far beyond the confines of her convent and directly into the heart of European spiritual and political discourse. Beyond the cloister, in the bustling world of secular power, noble women wielded parchment as a practical tool of governance and influence. Consider a figure like Helena of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages. As Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right and later Queen of France and then England, she controlled vast estates and complex legal jurisdictions. To manage this sprawling domain, she relied on a chancery that produced a constant stream of parchment documents, land grants, court judgments, diplomatic correspondence, and financial accounts. Helena would have been intimately familiar with the language of these charters, using them to reward loyal vassals, settle disputes, and administer justice. Her ability to command the production and use of these texts was a direct extension of her political power. For noble women like her, who often governed territories while their husbands were away at war or on crusade, literacy and administrative skill were not optional hobbies, they were essential tools of statecraft. Their command of the written word allowed them to protect their families' interests, build political alliances, and leave a lasting imprint on the legal and cultural landscape of their realms. The role of women as patrons of the written word further shatters the myth of female passivity. Wealthy aristocratic women and powerful abbesses were among the most important commissioners of lavish, illuminated manuscripts. By funding the creation of a magnificent prayer book or a personal psalter, a woman could make a bold statement about her piety, her wealth, and her cultural sophistication. These books were often personalized with her portrait within the illuminations, showing her presented to the Virgin Mary or seated in study, actively engaging with the text. This was a form of self-representation and legacy building, a way to ensure her memory and her devotion would be physically preserved in an object of beauty and sanctity. Furthermore, many of these patronized manuscripts were explicitly intended for female use: psalters for noblewomen, liturgical books for convents, guides for anchoresses. This female-centric book production created a parallel literary world that catered to and reflected women's spiritual concerns and experiences, fostering a distinct culture of female readership and devotion that has often been overlooked in historical accounts. The cumulative effect of all this activity, the copying, the authoring, the governing, the patronizing, forces us to completely rethink the medieval woman's relationship to the written word. It paints a picture not of universal illiteracy and confinement, but of varied and often strategic engagement. For every woman who could not read, there was an abbess who ran a library, a noblewoman who audited account rolls, or a merchant's wife who kept the business records. Their involvement demonstrates that parchment was not merely an instrument of patriarchal control. In the right hands, it could be a tool of female agency, a means to carve out spaces for learning, expression, and authority within a society that offered women few formal avenues to power. The very survival of their work, often against the odds of time and historical neglect, is a powerful reminder that the story of knowledge in the Middle Ages has always had two authors, and we are only now beginning to properly listen to the second. This incredible duality, where the same material could enforce official doctrine and fuel fiery dissent, finds its perfect embodiment in the very book that sat at the heart of medieval Christianity, the Bible. For centuries, the Church's immense authority was built upon a foundation of controlled knowledge, and the key to that control was a single, standardized Latin translation known as the Vulgate. Imagine the power inherent in this situation. In a world where perhaps 90% of the population was illiterate, and even those who could read were almost exclusively taught in Latin, the Word of God was filtered through a single, approved lens. The production of these Vulgate Bibles was a monumental undertaking, reserved for the most skilled scribes in the most trusted Scriptoria. Every beautifully illuminated page, every perfectly formed letter of Latin text, was a physical assertion of ecclesiastical unity and control. A parish priest didn't interpret Scripture. He delivered the Church's interpretation, read from this unchallengeable parchment authority. This wasn't just about consistency, it was about maintaining a theological monopoly. Any alternative interpretation, any whisper of a different reading, could be dismissed as error or heresy because it did not align with the official, parchment-backed Vulgate text. The book itself, as a magnificent physical object, became a symbol of an unbroken chain of orthodoxy stretching back to the Church Fathers. Yet, in a beautiful irony, the very qualities that made parchment ideal for preserving orthodoxy, its durability, its portability, and its authority, also made it the perfect vehicle for those who sought to challenge that very same power. If you were a reformer or a member of a persecuted sect, how could you spread your ideas and ensure they survived? You couldn't shout your beliefs in a town square and hope they were remembered. You needed to write them down. And you needed a material that could be smuggled, hidden, and passed from hand to hand without falling apart. Parchment was that material. The Cathars, a dualist Christian movement declared heretical by the Church in the 12th and 13th centuries, understood this perfectly. Despite facing crusades and the brutal efforts of the Inquisition to eradicate them, the Cathars used secretly copied texts to maintain their theological coherence and network of believers across southern France and northern Italy. These clandestine manuscripts, containing their unique interpretations of scripture and spiritual teachings, were their lifeline. They could be rolled up and concealed, carried by itinerant preachers known as perfecti, and studied in safe houses. The durability of parchment meant that even if a community was scattered, their ideas could survive in a physical form, waiting to be rediscovered and reignited by a future generation. The Church's own preferred medium became the heretic's most powerful tool for resistance. This revolutionary potential exploded into the open with the work of 14th-century Oxford theologian John Wycliffe. His fundamental challenge was breathtakingly simple yet radical. He argued that the Bible belonged to the people, not just to the clergy, and that everyone should be able to access it in their own language. To make this a reality, he and his followers, known as Lollards, embarked on the first complete translation of the Vulgate Bible into Middle English. This act of translation was itself considered heretical by the church authorities, who saw the Latin Vulgate as the only acceptable version, but Wycliffe's project didn't stop there. The Lollards then began the dangerous and painstaking work of manually copying this English translation onto hundreds of sheets of parchment. These manuscripts, known as Wycliffe Bibles, were then circulated underground. They were not the lavishly illuminated books of the aristocracy. They were often plain, functional, and produced in secret to avoid detection, yet their impact was seismic. For the first time, a prosperous merchant in London, a farmer in the Midlands, or an artisan in York could, if they had learned to read, engage directly with the biblical text without a priest acting as a gatekeeper. They could read Christ's words in their own tongue and draw their own conclusions. This empowerment through vernacular scripture directly undermined the clergy's exclusive role as interpreters of divine will, planting the intellectual seeds that would later blossom into the Protestant Reformation. The parchment page itself became the arena for this intellectual combat. Theologians on all sides of a debate relied on its stability to craft complex, nuanced arguments that could be examined, debated, and copied for wider distribution. A scholar defending church doctrine could write a detailed refutation of a heresy, point by point, knowing that his precise wording would be preserved exactly as he intended as it was copied. Conversely, a critic of church corruption could draft a lengthy treatise, carefully laying out his evidence and reasoning, and have it circulated among a network of sympathetic readers. This was a world of slow, deliberate, and meticulous debate, made possible by a medium that allowed for complexity and permanence. Disagreements were not settled in shouting matches, but through written polemics that traveled from one university to another, from one monastery to a noble court. The physicality of these texts meant that ideas had weight and could be archived, creating a long-term record of theological conflict that could be revisited and re-rigged years later. This culture of written disputation, all happening on parchment, ensured that religious thought was never static. It was a living, breathing, and often contentious conversation that slowly but relentlessly drove the evolution of Christian belief, proving that the most potent battles for the soul of Europe were often fought not with blades, but with carefully formulated arguments inscribed on treated animal skin. But the reach of a medieval commander extended far beyond the battle cries of his frontline troops. His true authority was measured by the distance his written orders could travel and be obeyed. Consider the monumental challenge of the Norman invasion of England in 1066. William the Conqueror did not simply cross the Channel with an army. He arrived with a full administrative apparatus, and its lifeblood was parchment. To secure his conquest, he couldn't just win a single battle at Hastings. He had to control a hostile nation. This required a continuous stream of communication across the English countryside. Written dispatches on parchment would have been sent to his subordinate commanders, detailing where to establish garrison forts, how to requisition supplies from local villages, and which Anglo-Saxon nobles required watching. A scout's report on enemy movements, hastily scribbled on a scrap of parchment, could be rushed back to headquarters, informing the next strategic decision. This flow of information allowed William to react to threats and manage his forces with a coordination that would have been utterly impossible through shouted commands or messengers' memory alone. The quill, in this context, was a force multiplier, enabling one man's will to be executed with precision across a vast and unfamiliar territory. The complexity of medieval warfare demanded an astonishing level of bureaucratic organization, all managed through written rolls and lists. Before a king could even think of embarking on a campaign, his clerks would spend weeks immersed in parchment work. Detailed supply inventories were essential. How many thousands of arrows were stored in the royal armories? How many barrels of salted fish and sacks of grain would be needed to feed the army for a month? A precise record of which feudal lords had fulfilled their obligation to provide knights and foot soldiers was crucial for enforcing muster and maintaining discipline. Once on the move, the army's train was a mobile city, and its logistics were a nightmare of coordination. Parchment chits would be used to authorize the release of supplies from wagons, while clerks kept running tallies of consumption to prevent shortages. The payroll for thousands of mercenaries, a common feature in medieval wars, required meticulous record-keeping to prevent mutiny. Every horse, every cart, every crossbowman represented a line item on a parchment roll, and the commander who lost track of those details risked seeing his formidable army dissolve into starvation and disorder before a single blow was struck. Perhaps the most fascinating military use of parchment was in the aftermath of conflict, where it served to formalize the messy and volatile outcomes of war. The battlefield victory was often just the beginning. Consolidating that victory required turning temporary conquest into permanent agreement. This is where the scribe's art became as important as the knight's valor. When a nobleman was captured, his release was not a simple matter of handshake deals. Elaborate ransom agreements were drafted on parchment, specifying the exact sum to be paid, the currencies accepted, the hostages exchanged to guarantee payment, and the date and place for the transaction. These documents were legally binding contracts that prevented future betrayal and ensured the lucrative business of ransoming could proceed with a degree of trust between enemies. Furthermore, the end of a war was sealed with a treaty, and these were monumental parchment productions. The Treaty of Verdun in 843, which divided Charlemagne's empire among his three grandsons, is a prime example. Its clauses, carefully inscribed, redrew the map of Europe for centuries to come, creating the rough outlines of what would become France and Germany. Such a document didn't just record a peace, it was the peace. It provided an unambiguous, permanent reference point that rulers could invoke for generations to settle border disputes and reaffirm terms, preventing minor squabbles from reigniting into full-scale war. This administrative backbone fundamentally transformed the nature of power. A state's strength was no longer measured solely by the size of its army on the day of battle, but by its ability to consistently raise, fund, supply, and direct that army over long periods and across great distances. This required a permanent class of literate officials, chancery clerks, treasurers, judges who maintained the records that made continuous governance possible. The Domesday Book, William the Conqueror's Great Census, was the ultimate expression of this principle. It was a weapon of conquest far more subtle and enduring than the knight's sword. By systematically recording who owned what land across England, William wasn't just taking a snapshot of his new kingdom's wealth. He was creating an unassailable legal basis for taxation and royal authority that would last for centuries. The king who mastered the flow of information on parchment could project his power more effectively than one who merely won a few spectacular battles. He could plan campaigns years in advance, manage economies to fund them, and leave a legacy of administration that outlasted his own lifetime. In the final analysis, the medieval general's most crucial weapon may not have been his siege engine or his cavalry charge, but the humble scroll carried by a swift rider, for it was that piece of parchment that could coordinate a dozen such charges across a 100-mile front, turning a collection of armed men into a truly formidable army. Now let's turn our attention to one of parchment's most profound and lasting contributions to human civilization, its role as a lifeboat for the classical world. Imagine the vast intellectual wealth of antiquity, the accumulated wisdom of Greek and Roman thinkers, poets, and scientists. For centuries, this knowledge was recorded on papyrus scrolls, stored in great libraries like Alexandria. But papyrus is fragile, vulnerable to fire, moisture, and the simple ravages of time. As the Roman Empire crumbled and Europe entered a period of profound instability, these precious texts faced an existential threat. The great libraries were scattered or destroyed, and the economic and political structures that supported large-scale book production collapsed. The very survival of works by giants like Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and Virgil hung by a thread. It was in this precarious moment that a new group of custodians emerged, working not in bustling cosmopolitan centers but in the quiet, fortified solitude of monastic communities. Their mission, though they may not have fully grasped its global significance, was nothing less than the rescue of Western thought. With meticulous care, these monastic scribes began the monumental task of transferring this fading inheritance from decaying papyrus onto the new, durable medium of parchment. This was not a quick or simple copying job. It was an act of profound cultural preservation. A single work, like Plato's Republic or the medical texts of Galen, would require a scribe to dedicate weeks or even months of patient labor, meticulously tracing each letter, each word, onto a fresh, clean sheet of treated animal skin. This process ensured that the ideas within were no longer trapped on a fragile medium destined to turn to dust, but were instead granted a new, robust physical form capable of waiting out centuries of turmoil. The scope of what they saved is simply staggering. It wasn't just literature and philosophy, though the preservation of poets like Ovid and thinkers like Cicero would alone be enough to secure their legacy. These scribes also saved the foundational texts of science and medicine, the works of the physician Galen, which synthesized centuries of medical knowledge, were copied and recopied in monastic Scriptoria across Europe. His theories on anatomy and treatment would form the basis of medical practice for over 1,000 years. The astronomical and mathematical theories of Ptolemy and Euclid were similarly preserved, their complex diagrams and calculations carefully replicated by hands that understood their sacred duty to accuracy. Even practical manuals on agriculture, architecture, and engineering were deemed worthy of preservation. This wasn't a curated collection of only religious or philosophical texts. It was a wholesale salvage operation. The monks, in their pursuit of knowledge and their dedication to the liberal arts, acted as impartial guardians. They preserved the pagan poets alongside the Christian fathers, the secular science alongside the sacred scripture, understanding that all knowledge was part of God's creation and therefore possessed inherent value. This catholicity of interest meant that the full spectrum of classical thought, not just a narrow sliver approved by dogma, was saved from oblivion. To truly appreciate the magnitude of their achievement, we must engage in a sobering exercise of counterfactual history, imagining a world where this rescue mission failed. Without the diligent transcription onto parchment, the works of Aristotle would have been almost entirely lost to the Latin West. This means no Aristotle to serve as the foundation for Thomas Aquinas's great synthesis of faith and reason. The logical frameworks and systematic methods of inquiry that Aristotle pioneered would have been absent, potentially drastically altering the development of European philosophy and science. The elegant poetry of Virgil, whose Aeneid was so crucial to the formation of Roman and later European identity, might have survived only in fragments, a ghost of a lost culture. The sophisticated medical knowledge of Galen would have faded, leaving medieval medicine even more reliant on superstition and folk remedy. The very idea of the Renaissance, which means rebirth, would have been impossible because there would have been very little from the classical past left to rebirth. The cultural and intellectual trajectory of Europe would have been immeasurably poorer, shaped by a much narrower and more fragmented understanding of its own past. The patient scribes in their silent Scriptoria were not merely copyists, they were the essential bridge between the ancient world and the modern, the critical link without which the chain of intellectual history would have been broken forever. The success of this centuries-long project hinged on one key physical property: parchment's incredible durability. A well-made parchment codex stored in a monastic library or a nobleman's chest could easily survive for 500, 800, even 1,000 years. This resilience meant that these copied texts weren't just for immediate use, they were created with an eye toward eternity. They could be safely stored, waiting patiently like time capsules for a future age that was ready to rediscover and appreciate them. This is precisely what happened. The great intellectual flourishing of the 12th century and the Italian Renaissance of the 14th and 15th centuries were both fueled by the rediscovery of these very manuscripts. Scholars like Petrarch would famously seek out forgotten monastic libraries, and within their dusty chests, they would find the beautifully preserved parchment copies of Cicero's letters or Livy's histories, works that had been copied centuries earlier and then largely unread. The texts were not corrupted or faded, they were as legible and vibrant as the day they were inscribed. The durability of the medium had allowed the ideas within to enter a state of suspended animation, preserving their full potency until a more receptive cultural climate arrived to receive them. The Renaissance humanists didn't need to decipher crumbling papyrus fragments. They could engage directly with complete, high-quality texts, thanks to the foresight and craftsmanship of medieval scribes. This grand rescue mission stands as the ultimate testament to the long-term impact of medieval scribble culture. It reveals a society that, despite its reputation for violence and superstition, possessed a deep and abiding respect for the written word and a profound sense of stewardship for the knowledge of the past. The monks did not see themselves as innovators but as transmitters, humble vessels through which the wisdom of the ancients could flow into the future. Theirs was a culture of preservation, of faithful copying, of ensuring that the lamp of learning was never fully extinguished, even during what we now call the Dark Ages. Every time we read a translation of Plato's Symposium, study a geometrical proof from Euclid, or admire the political wisdom of Cicero, we are benefiting from the silent, patient labor of countless unnamed scribes who sat in cold rooms century after century, dedicating their lives to the simple, sacred act of copying. They understood something we often forget, that civilization is not a sudden conquest but a gradual inheritance, and that the most powerful act of rebellion against chaos and oblivion is to pick up a pen and carefully, faithfully, write it all down. Now, if you were to open one of those early medieval books, say from the 7th or 8th century, you might be struck not by its beauty but by its sheer difficulty. The text would appear as a relentless, intimidating block of letters, a phenomenon scholars call scriptio continua, Words ran together without spaces. There was no punctuation to mark the end of a sentence or a pause for breath, and paragraphs were unheard of. Reading aloud, which was the most common way to experience a text, required immense skill and prior familiarity with the content. The reader had to already know where the natural breaks were, almost like deciphering a complex code. This wasn't a design choice meant to be obstructive. It was simply a carryover from the ancient tradition of reading from scrolls, where the text was unspooled gradually, and the reader provided the rhythm and cadence through their performance. But for a society that was increasingly relying on the written word for law, administration, and complex theology, this chaotic presentation was a major barrier to efficient communication and learning. The page itself was a wall of text that had to be scaled before any meaning could be extracted. The transformation from this chaos to the clarity we expect today was a slow, centuries-long revolution in design, driven by the practical needs of scribes and scholars. It began with small, almost tentative innovations. A scribe might insert a single point, a punctus, to mark a minor pause, or a slightly larger space to indicate a more significant break in the thought. These were not standardized rules but personal shorthand, little navigational aids added by copyists to help themselves and future readers. The real breakthrough came with the systematic development of a hierarchy of punctuation. By the Carolingian period, a more sophisticated system emerged. A punctus versus a semicolon-like mark could denote the end of a sentence. A punctus elevatus, a reverse semicolon, indicated a question or a major clause, and the simple punctus remained for a short pause. This created a visual roadmap for the text, allowing a reader to understand its grammatical structure at a glance. For the first time, a person could read silently to themselves and comprehend complex sentences without needing to sound them out, a fundamental shift in the very nature of reading that turned it from a public performance into a private, contemplative act. Alongside punctuation came the revolutionary concept of the paragraph. Scribes began to leave the first line of a new section slightly indented, or later, they would exaggerate the first letter, pushing it out into the margin. This large, decorated initial letter, often filled with intricate patterns or even tiny scenes, was more than just decoration. It was a powerful visual signal. It shouted to the reader, "A new idea starts here." It allowed for easy reference and navigation. A scholar looking for a specific passage in a theological text could now flip through the pages and find it by locating these major visual breaks, rather than having to read every single line from the beginning. This organizational leap was crucial for the creation of reference books, legal compendiums, and scholarly commentaries, where finding a specific piece of information quickly was paramount. The text was no longer a continuous stream but a structured landscape of ideas, each with its own clearly marked territory. The most significant physical innovation, however, was the triumph of the codex over the scroll. The ancient world had sworn by the scroll, or volumen, but early Christians largely adopted the codex sheets of parchment folded and bound together along one edge, much like a modern book. The advantages were immediate and overwhelming. A codex could hold the text of multiple scrolls in a single, compact volume, but its true genius was its capacity for random access. You could not easily jump to the middle of a scroll. You had to unroll it, a slow and cumbersome process. With a codex, you could flip directly to any page, any chapter, any specific point you needed to reference. This revolutionized study, debate, and law. A lawyer could cross-reference different statutes quickly. A theologian could compare passages from the Old and New Testaments side by side. The codex turned information from a linear sequence into a navigable space, dramatically increasing the speed and efficiency with which knowledge could be accessed and utilized. It was a user interface breakthrough of monumental proportions. All of these layout innovations were perfectly complemented by the parallel evolution in handwriting itself. The shift from stately, majestic scripts like uncial to the nimble, efficient scripts we now call minuscules. Uncial is beautiful with its rounded, separate capital letters that look like a formal inscription on a Roman monument, but it is also incredibly space inefficient and slow to write. As demand for books grew beyond just luxurious liturgical volumes, scribes needed a faster, more compact hand. The answer was minuscule script, which used a combination of upper and lower case letters, with letters that could be connected to save space and increase writing speed. The crowning achievement of this trend was, as we've discussed, Carolingian minuscule, with its perfectly legible, separated letters and clear word spacing. This wasn't just a change in aesthetics, it was a shift towards mass production and accessibility. A text written in a clear minuscule script on a well-organized codex page was fundamentally easier to read, faster to copy, and cheaper to produce than its predecessor. It democratized the page, making it a tool for practical use rather than just ceremonial display. This cumulative progress in script and lay out the invention of punctuation, the birth of the paragraph, the adoption of the codex, and the refinement of minuscule scripts didn't just make reading more pleasant, it fundamentally altered how people thought about information. It created the conditions for an explosion of complexity in every field of written endeavor. Legal texts could now be intricately indexed and cross-referenced. Scientific and medical manuscripts could incorporate detailed diagrams, footnotes, and marginal annotations. Literary works could develop more complex narrative structures, knowing that a reader could easily keep their place. This was the quiet, unheralded groundwork upon which the entire edifice of modern publishing, from the Gutenberg Bible to the textbook you might have on your shelf, is built. Every space between words, every indented paragraph, every chapter heading in a modern book is a direct descendant of those painstaking medieval innovations, a testament to the anonymous scribes who slowly, patiently taught us how to read. Imagine the journey of a young student in a medieval cathedral school, his most prized possession not a toy or a tool, but a humble wax tablet. This reusable board, filled with a layer of darkened wax, was the training ground for literacy. Here, with a pointed stylus, he would painstakingly practice forming letters, scratching out his exercises again and again. The wax was forgiving and, most importantly, cheap. Mastery on this temporary surface was the essential prerequisite for the ultimate graduation, the privilege of writing on parchment. That first step to using the real thing was a monumental moment, a transition from practice to permanence, because every single sheet represented a significant financial investment. This careful, cost-conscious approach to learning ensured that only those who had truly mastered the fundamentals would ever handle the precious material that contained real knowledge. The core of this education was a structured curriculum known as the liberal arts, divided into the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, was the foundation of all learning, and it was taught directly from parchment textbooks. A student's grammar lesson might involve a heavily annotated copy of Donatus's Ars Minor, the standard textbook that taught Latin through its complex declensions and conjugations. Rhetoric was learned from Cicero's works, studying the art of persuasion not as an abstract theory, but as a practical skill essential for lawyers, diplomats, and preachers. Logic, often derived from newly rediscovered texts by Aristotle, taught students how to construct a valid argument and detect a fallacy. These weren't dry academic exercises. They were the essential toolkit for anyone who wished to operate in the world of power and ideas. The quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music then built upon this linguistic foundation with mathematical and scientific knowledge. Geometry relied on Euclid's elements, its precise diagrams carefully copied onto parchment pages. Astronomy required planetary tables and tracts, and music involved studying complex musical notation and theory. The entire system was designed to produce not just a learned person, but a disciplined, logical thinker capable of analysis, debate, and effective communication. This entire educational ecosystem was utterly dependent on the availability of parchment copies. A university like the one in Paris or Bologna was at its heart a collection of texts. There was no printing press, so the production of these textbooks was a constant, vital industry. This was managed through a system called the Picia, where stationers, licensed by the university, would hold official, corrected master copies of key texts. They would then break these master copies into separate sections or quires, and rent these individual sections out to students. A student could hire a scribe to copy the section they needed, or copy it themselves before returning the master quire and renting the next one. This ingenious system allowed for the relatively rapid and accurate multiplication of textbooks, making it possible for dozens of students to simultaneously access the same essential materials. Without this organized, parchment-based economy, the university itself could not have functioned. The lecture hall was where a master read from and commented on the text, but the real learning happened afterward, in private study with one's own personal copy, painstakingly created through this rental system. The outcome of this educational revolution was the creation of a new social class, a literate professional elite. This was a profound shift from an earlier era where power was based almost solely on land ownership and martial prowess. Now a man, and it was almost always men at this stage, could advance through society based on his intellectual merit and specialized training. The ability to read complex legal texts created a class of lawyers who could navigate the growing thicket of royal and canon law. Those skilled in rhetoric and logic found careers as diplomats, royal secretaries, and high-ranking clerics who drafted papal bulls and royal correspondence. Even the management of large estates and the growing complexities of long-distance trade required a level of literacy and numeracy that created a demand for educated stewards and accountants. These were not monks seeking spiritual enlightenment. They were ambitious, secular professionals whose skills were their currency. They formed a bureaucracy that was loyal not to a feudal lord but to the state or the institution they served, and their authority was derived from their command of the written word, not the swing of a sword. This pervasive emphasis on text-based learning did more than just create jobs. It fundamentally reshaped how people thought. The process of constantly reading, analyzing, and debating complex texts fostered a culture of critical thinking and intellectual rigor. Students were trained to question, to dissect arguments, and to look for internal consistency. This mindset, cultivated in the lecture halls and libraries of medieval universities, laid the essential groundwork for all future scientific and scholarly inquiry. The professional specialization it enabled meant that knowledge could deepen in specific fields. A lawyer could spend a lifetime delving into the nuances of jurisprudence. A physician could study the works of Galen and Avicenna in depth, and a theologian could dedicate himself to reconciling faith and reason. This division of intellectual labor accelerated progress in every field, as experts could build upon the written work of those who came before them, creating an accumulating body of knowledge rather than constantly relearning the same basics. The humble parchment page, passed from master to student and copied again and again, became the medium for this great conversation across generations, slowly but surely building the intellectual foundations of the modern world. Now consider the monumental task facing a medieval scribe, perhaps in a bustling London scriptorium around the year 1380. He has been commissioned to copy a new, highly popular collection of stories written by a courtier named Geoffrey Chaucer, but these tales are not in the refined Latin of the Church or the law. They are written in the messy, vibrant, and wildly variable English of the London streets. The poet's own handwritten copy is a labyrinth of spelling inconsistencies and local colloquialisms. Our scribe dips his quill, and in that moment he becomes more than just a copyist. He becomes an unwitting architect of language. He must make a choice. Does he write the word for woman, as the author sometimes spells it, women, or does he use the more common woman he's seen in other texts? Does he use the Northern English kirk or the Southern church? Every stroke of his pen is a tiny vote in a centuries-long election that would eventually determine the standard form of English. This was the hidden power of the scribe, not just to preserve language, but to actively shape and stabilize it through thousands of such small, conscious decisions made in Scriptoria across Europe. They were the first editors, the first grammarians working without any official rulebook, guided only by emerging conventions and their own sense of clarity. This process of standardization was perhaps the only force powerful enough to tame the incredible linguistic chaos of medieval Europe. Before the widespread use of parchment for vernacular texts, what we call English or French was actually a scattered constellation of local dialects, often so distinct that a speaker from one region could barely understand someone from another 100 miles away. A word could have a dozen different spellings, and grammar was a matter of local custom, not fixed rules. Parchment provided the necessary physical anchor to slow this relentless drift. When a particularly influential text, like a royal proclamation or a popular poem, was widely copied and distributed, the specific language choices made by its scribes began to carry immense authority. Other scribes copying those copies would tend to replicate those spellings and forms, seeing them as more prestigious or correct. Over time, a sort of consensus emerged around the dialect used in centers of power and commerce: the English of London, the French of Paris, the Castilian of Toledo. This written standard didn't erase local dialects, but it created a high-prestige common ground, a lingua franca for the page that allowed a merchant from York to correspond with a counterpart in Bristol using a shared written language, even if their spoken accents were thick and unfamiliar. The relationship between Latin and these emerging vernaculars was a complex dance of authority and rebellion. For centuries, Latin reigned supreme as the language of ultimate seriousness, the language of God, law, science, and international diplomacy. Its grammar was fixed, its vocabulary vast and precise. To write something on parchment in Latin was to declare its eternal importance and universal relevance. But this created a powerful tension. The vast majority of people, including many nobles, did not think or dream in Latin. They lived their lives in the vibrant pulse of their mother tongue. The decision to commit a vernacular work like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales or Dante's Divine Comedy to parchment was therefore a revolutionary act. It was a declaration that the stories of a worldly innkeeper or the profound spiritual visions of a poet were worthy of the same medium that preserved the Bible and the laws of kings. These works, by being written down, gained a permanence and prestige that elevated the vernacular itself. They proved that English, Italian, or French could be vehicles for not just everyday gossip, but for high art, complex philosophy, and deep piety. Scribes copying these works were now standardizing a language of the people, not just the clergy, actively building the foundations for modern national identities that were rooted in a shared literary heritage rather than just a shared ruler. The impact of this scribble standardization echoes in our lives every single day. The very fact that you can read this script and understand it without struggle is a direct result of this centuries-long process. The correct spellings we labor over in school, the grammatical rules we unconsciously follow, even the size of our modern vocabulary, were all profoundly influenced by the cumulative choices of those medieval scribes. They decided which words were formal enough to be written down and which were left to the ephemeral world of speech. They gradually regularized verb conjugations and noun plurals, smoothing out the roughest edges of local dialects to create a more universally comprehensible written language. This created a powerful feedback loop. The standardized written form began to influence the spoken language of the elite, further cementing its status. A new form of power was born, cultural power derived from linguistic mastery. Those who could command the emerging standard written form, the lawyers, the bureaucrats, the poets, gained immense influence, shaping how people saw the world through the very words they used to describe it. The humble scribe, in standardizing the language, was quietly building the framework for modern literature, for mass education, and for the very concept of a unified national culture that could be shared by millions. And so, this transformation of words into a sacred object reached its most spectacular expression in the rituals that bound medieval society together. Picture the scene at Westminster Abbey for the coronation of a new King of England. The air is thick with incense and the murmur of prayer, the assembled nobility resplendent in silks and jewels. But amidst all this human splendor, the true star of the ceremony is not a person, but an object. At the pivotal moment, a magnificent illuminated manuscript is brought forward with great reverence, the Liber Regalis, or royal book. This isn't merely a guide for the priests, it is a script for the divine theater of power. Its pages, crafted from the finest vellum and glowing with gold leaf, contain the precise words and actions for the anointing, the oath-swearing, and the crowning itself. When the archbishop reads the coronation oath from this book, he isn't just reciting words, he is channeling the unbroken authority of centuries, each syllable given weight by the physical beauty and permanence of the text from which it is read. The book itself becomes a participant in the ritual, a tangible link to every monarch who has been crowned before, visually assuring everyone present that this moment is not a break with tradition but its glorious fulfillment. This performative power of parchment extended far beyond the church and into the very heart of political theater. Imagine a great hall where two powerful barons have been locked in a bitter land dispute for years, their men-at-arms skirmishing along the contested border. To settle it, the king has summoned his court. After hearing the arguments, a royal clerk steps forward, unrolling a large, imposing parchment scroll. It is a survey commissioned by the king's grandfather, and as the clerk reads the precise description of the boundary line, from the old oak tree north to the stream, then following the ridge. The words take on the force of law. The physical act of unrolling that document, its seals dangling, commands the room's attention. The dry, legal language spoken aloud transforms a dusty record into a living verdict. The losing lord cannot argue with the king's knight, but he is powerless against the silent testimony of the parchment. Its age and formality grant it an unimpeachable authority, making the king's judgment feel not like a personal whim, but the inevitable application of ancient and impartial law. The document doesn't just record the agreement, it performs the resolution, using its ceremonial presentation to compel obedience and end conflict. The creation of these ceremonial documents was itself a ritualized act infused with symbolic meaning that far exceeded their textual content. The choice of materials was deliberate and spoke volumes. The finest, whitest calf vellum was reserved for the most important charters, its quality immediately signaling the significance of the words it bore. The inks were not merely functional, The use of a deep, rich black made from oak gall or a vibrant vermilion red for initial letters and royal signatures conveyed importance and divine sanction. But the most powerful symbol was the seal. Attaching a seal was the final, crucial step in giving life to a document. The wax, often a distinctive color like blood red or forest green, was heated and impressed with the matrix of the ruler's unique signet ring. This act was so symbolic that it was often performed in a public ceremony, with witnesses watching as the warm wax received the mark of authority. The resulting seal, dangling from the parchment on a silk cord or a strip of the parchment itself, was more than a signature. It was a physical extension of the ruler's person. To break a seal was to violate the authority it represented, which is why treaties and laws were always stored with their seals intact, as a perpetual witness to the authenticity of the agreement. The document and its seal were inseparable partners in the performance of power. Perhaps nowhere was this fusion of spiritual and royal spectacle more complete than in the practice of displaying sacred texts as relics. In many medieval churches, the Gospel book was treated with the same reverence as the bones of a saint. During major religious festivals, the most magnificent illuminated manuscript in the monastery's collection might be carried in a solemn procession through the streets, held aloft for the faithful to see. Its jeweled cover would catch the sunlight, and the crowd would react not to the words inside, which they couldn't read, but to the object itself, a shimmering, beautiful, and unimaginably valuable vessel of the Holy Word. This transformed the book from a repository of text into a holy talisman, a source of divine blessing made manifest in the community. Its power was not just informational but talismanic. Its presence was believed to protect and sanctify. Similarly, royal charters of foundation for a monastery would be read aloud annually on the saint's day of its patron, a ritual that reminded the current monks of their rights and privileges while simultaneously reinforcing the enduring bond between the crown and the church. The ceremony around the parchment ensured its terms were never forgotten, its authority continually renewed with each performance. This profound ceremonial role cemented parchment's status as the ultimate medium for moments that were meant to echo through the ages. It provided the stage upon which the most critical acts of state and faith were performed. The document was no longer a passive record but an active agent of transformation. It made a man a king, turned a truce into a peace, and transformed a spoken vow into an eternal covenant. Its physical grandeur, from the sheen of its surface to the brilliance of its illuminations, justified the immense weight of the words it carried. This was the genius of parchment in ceremony. It made abstract authority visible, tangible, and awe-inspiring. It appealed to the senses to convince the mind, using beauty and ritual to command loyalty and belief in a way that raw force alone never could. The spectacle surrounding these documents proved that the most effective power is often that which is performed, and in the medieval world, there was no greater stage for that performance than a flawless sheet of parchment, elevated from mere animal skin to a sacred object that could crown kings and make peace between nations. Yet for all its power in war and ceremony, parchment found one of its most profound and lasting applications in the delicate art of peacemaking. In a world fractured into hundreds of competing realms, dukedoms, and bishoprics, the only thing more constant than conflict was the desperate need to find stable ways to end it. Imagine two kings, their armies exhausted and their treasuries drained after years of brutal warfare. They meet in a tented field surrounded by wary advisors. They agree to terms, but a spoken truce is a fragile thing, vulnerable to fading memories and shifting interpretations the moment the parties ride away. The true resolution, the thing that would actually stop the fighting, came later, when teams of scribes from both sides locked themselves away with their pens and their best sheets of parchment. Their task was to translate the broad strokes of the verbal agreement into the precise, unassailable language of a binding treaty. Every clause, every condition, every exception had to be meticulously spelled out. The description of a new border wasn't just from the river to the hills. It became a detailed geographical survey, naming specific landmarks to eliminate any future ambiguity. The terms for the exchange of prisoners, the payment of reparations, the guarantees for safe passage, all were rendered in the dry, legalistic prose that left no room for creative reinterpretation. This document, once sealed, became the peace. It was the physical embodiment of the agreement, a tangible object that could be stored in a treasury and produced decades later to hold successors to their ancestors' vows. Perhaps no single document illustrates this power better than the Treaty of Verdun, signed in the year 843. This was not a peace between two minor lords. It was the final, solemn division of the vast Carolingian Empire among Charlemagne's three warring grandsons. The entire political map of Western Europe was being redrawn. The scribes who drafted this treaty were, in effect, cartographers of destiny, using words on parchment to create new kingdoms from thin air. The text assigned Lothair the central strip of territory stretching from the North Sea to Italy, a realm that would become an enduring fracture zone between its neighbors. Louis the German received the lands east of the Rhine, laying the foundation for what would become Germany. Charles the Bald was granted the Western Territories, the kernel of modern France. The precision of this written division was everything. Without it, the Civil War would have likely continued until one brother emerged victorious, potentially creating a very different Europe. The Parchment of Verdun provided a negotiated, mutually recognized solution that, for all its flaws, established a framework for stability. For centuries afterward, rulers would invoke this very document to justify their claims and define their borders, proving that a carefully written treaty could outlast empires and shape the destinies of nations for 1,000 years. Beyond these monumental set-piece treaties, parchment was the lifeblood of day-to-day diplomacy, enabling a continuous conversation between courts separated by weeks of travel. A king in England could not simply call his ally in Castile for a quick chat. Instead, he relied on a corps of clerks and scribes to draft detailed letters of credence for his ambassadors, giving them the written authority to speak on his behalf. These diplomatic missives, carried by trusted couriers across mountain passes and pirate-haunted seas, were the strategic nervous system of medieval statecraft. They allowed for complex, multi-party negotiations to unfold over months. A proposal for a military alliance against a common enemy could be sent to a dozen different rulers, their counter-offers and conditions collected and compared. Marriage contracts, the ultimate tool of dynastic diplomacy, were particularly elaborate parchment productions. These were far more than simple announcements of a wedding. They were dense legal documents that spelled out the dowry, the dower rights of the bride, the succession rights of any future children, and the precise military and financial obligations each house now owed the other. A single royal marriage contract could effectively rewrite the balance of power on the continent, and it was the unambiguity of the parchment record that gave all parties the confidence to proceed, knowing that the terms were fixed and could be enforced. This reliance on the written word introduced a new level of foresight and strategic depth into international relations. Because communication was so slow, every document had to be crafted with an eye toward the future, anticipating potential disputes and closing loopholes before they could be exploited. Ambassadors carried with them not only their initial instructions but also sealed, secret fallback positions authorized by their king, to be opened and used only if negotiations reached a stalemate. This required rulers and their advisors to think several moves ahead, like chess players, and to encode their strategies in the careful language of parchment scrolls. The cumulative effect of all this correspondence and treaty-making was the gradual creation of a shared international system, a common understanding of protocol, law, and diplomacy that transcended any one kingdom. It created a world where even bitter enemies acknowledged a common framework for ending wars and managing relationships. In a landscape perpetually on the brink of fragmentation, the humble parchment scroll functioned as a crucial tool of cohesion, a thin, durable thread of written agreement that helped bind a divided continent together, proving that the most enduring victories are often those won not by the sword, but by the pen. But this remarkable system of preservation and power came with a sobering and often overlooked price tag, one measured not in coin but in life and land. To truly appreciate the scale of parchment production, we must step out of the quiet scriptorium and into the bustling, often grim, world of the medieval tannery and farm. The demand for writing material was insatiable, and it created a relentless pull on agricultural resources. A single large Bible, like the massive Codex Amiatinus, could require the skins of over 500 calves. This wasn't a casual byproduct of the meat industry. In many cases, herds were specifically managed and culled for their skins. Farmers might prioritize breeding for animals with the finest, most blemish-free hides, altering centuries of traditional animal husbandry focused primarily on meat, milk, and wool. The very landscape could be shaped by this demand, with pastures and water resources dedicated to sustaining the herds that fed the Scriptoria and chanceries of Europe. The production of parchment, therefore, wasn't just a craft. It was a major economic driver that intertwined with the most fundamental aspects of medieval life: what people ate, how they farmed, and how they managed the land itself. This scale of production inevitably raised profound ethical questions, even within a society deeply accustomed to the utilitarian use of animals. Within the walls of monasteries, the very heart of parchment production, a quiet debate simmered among some of the most devout. If the central tenet of their faith was compassion for all God's creation, what was the spiritual cost of creating a sacred text? The process required the taking of life, and not in a swift, respectful manner for sustenance, but in an industrial-scale operation to produce a luxury object. Some religious orders, particularly those with strict ascetic principles, wrestled with this paradox. They sought compromises, such as only using the skins of animals that had died of natural causes, though this was wholly impractical for meeting real demand. Others rationalized the practice by viewing the final product as so sublime, so crucial for the salvation of human souls, that it justified the means. The magnificent illuminated Bible, glowing with divine light, effectively sanctified the sacrifice of the animals that made it possible. This tension between spiritual idealism and practical necessity highlights a medieval understanding that every human advancement, even the pursuit of divine knowledge, carried a hidden moral and environmental cost. The economic impact of this industry was equally complex, creating a curious paradox of value. On one hand, the high cost of parchment cemented its status as a luxury good and a powerful tool of social control. It ensured that literacy, education, and the legal authority that came with written documents remained largely the domain of the elite, the church, and the aristocracy who could afford the vast quantities of animal skins required. This created a self-perpetuating cycle where the powerful controlled the means of knowledge production, and therefore the dominant narrative of history itself. On the other hand, this very demand stimulated local economies. Parchment production supported a whole ecosystem of trades: the farmers who raised the animals, the skinners and butchers who prepared the carcasses, the merchants who traded in lime and other chemicals, and the specialized parchmenters who possessed the rare skills to transform a raw hide into a flawless writing surface. In towns near major monastic centers or royal courts, parchment making could be a significant source of employment and commerce, weaving itself into the economic fabric of the community. The high value of the finished product meant that this specialized knowledge was fiercely guarded, passed down within families or guilds, creating a class of skilled artisans whose expertise was their livelihood. These concerns from the medieval world resonate with a striking urgency in our modern context. The story of parchment is a powerful pre-industrial example of a technology's life cycle assessment, a full accounting of its impact from resource extraction to final use. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about our own tools. The servers that host our digital cloud, for instance, consume staggering amounts of water and energy, while the devices we read on require rare earth minerals mined in often devastating conditions. We too have created a knowledge economy with profound hidden costs, conveniently obscured by the sleek, weightless feel of a smartphone or tablet. The medieval debate over the ethics of parchment is a precursor to our own conversations about sustainable technology and ethical consumption. It reminds us that there is no such thing as a truly free medium for information. Every tool we use to communicate and preserve our culture is embedded in a web of material and ethical consequences. The quest for knowledge has always required resources, and the history of parchment challenges us to look beyond the brilliance of the illuminated page to see the field, the animal, and the artisan, acknowledging the full, complex cost of making our thoughts permanent. Yet for all its resilience and prestige, the reign of parchment was not destined to last forever. A quiet revolution was brewing, one that began not in the Scriptoria of Europe, but in the bustling paper mills of the Islamic world. The knowledge of papermaking, a technology invented in China nearly 1,000 years earlier, had traveled slowly along the Silk Road, reaching the cities of Samarkand and Baghdad by the 8th century. Muslim artisans perfected the process, creating a smooth, white paper from a pulp of linen and hemp rags suspended in water. This method was nothing short of revolutionary. Unlike parchment, which required the life of an animal and days of skilled labor for a single sheet, paper could be produced from cheap, abundant, and endlessly renewable materials. By the 12th century, this technology had crossed into Christian Europe through the cultural crossroads of Islamic Spain. The first paper mills on the continent began to appear in the Italian peninsula and in the south of France, their water wheels powering the hammers that mashed rags into pulp. Initially, this new material was met with deep suspicion by the established powers. In 1221, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Roman II declared all official documents written on paper to be legally invalid, and the papal chancery continued to insist on parchment for its most important decrees for another 200 years. There was a pervasive belief that this stuff made from recycled rags was inherently flimsy and ephemeral, utterly unfit for documents intended to last for eternity, a mere vulgar substitute for the noble, animal-based permanence of parchment. The economic argument for paper, however, was simply too powerful to ignore. The cost difference was staggering. A single sheet of high-quality parchment could cost a day's wages for a skilled laborer, while a sheet of paper could be produced for a fraction of that price. This affordability unleashed a torrent of new writing. Merchants, who once had to be frugal with their record-keeping, could now afford to draft contracts, keep detailed ledgers, and maintain extensive correspondence. Students at burgeoning universities who could never have dreamed of owning a parchment copy of a textbook could now purchase paper copies for note-taking and study. Writers and poets, freed from the financial terror of wasting expensive parchment, could draft and redraft their work, leading to an explosion of creativity in the vernacular languages of Europe. Paper became the medium of the moment for the ephemeral, the experimental, and the economical. It handled the bustling, messy business of a society that was rapidly becoming more literate, more commercial, and more bureaucratic. This wasn't a story of parchment being completely abandoned overnight. Instead, a pragmatic hierarchy emerged. For the most solemn, sacred, and legally binding purposes, a royal charter, an illuminated Bible, a last will and testament, nothing but the durable, luxurious surface of parchment would do. Its very substance continued to convey gravity, permanence, and authority. Paper, meanwhile, became the workhorse of everyday life, the material for the first draft, the personal letter, the school book, and the merchant's account. Society wisely matched the tool to the task, using the enduring strength of parchment for its foundations and the nimble efficiency of paper for its ever-growing scaffolding. This gradual shift became a seismic transformation with the invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg around 1450. Gutenberg's machine was a marvel of engineering, but its true revolutionary potential hinged on the choice of material. He famously did produce a number of magnificent vellum copies of his Bible for his wealthiest patrons, and these volumes stand as some of the most beautiful books ever made. But the economics were clear. Printing a full Bible on parchment would have required the skins of approximately 5,000 calves, making each copy astronomically expensive and the entire print run logistically impossible. Paper was the only practical medium for mass production. The press could churn out hundreds of identical pages from a single set of type, and paper could be fed through it efficiently and cheaply. The combination was explosive. Ideas could now be reproduced and distributed on a scale previously unimaginable. A single controversial text, like Martin Luther's 95 Theses, could be printed and spread across Germany in a matter of weeks, not years, fundamentally challenging the authority of the Church in a way that handwritten pamphlets on parchment never could. The printing press, married to paper, didn't just make books cheaper. It democratized knowledge itself, breaking the monopoly that the ecclesiastical and aristocratic elites had held on the written word for centuries. With this democratization, however, came a certain loss: the intimate, sacred connection between the scribe and the page. The incredible individuality of every single manuscript began to fade. A printed book was uniform. Every copy of Gutenberg's Bible was identical to the next. The personality of the scribe, his unique hand, his occasional doodles in the margin, the tiny corrections he made was erased, replaced by the cold precision of movable type. The breathtaking artistry of the illuminated manuscript, where every page was a unique masterpiece of gold leaf and pigment, became a luxury increasingly reserved for special presentation copies, not the common book. The craft of the parchmenter, once a vital and respected trade, gradually diminished in importance, its practitioners left to serve a shrinking market for luxury goods and certain persistent legal documents. The end of the parchment era was not a sudden death, but a long, slow sunset. It persisted for centuries in specific niches. England's Parliament recorded its statutes on parchment until the 19th century, and some high-end legal diplomas are still produced on it today for the sheer symbolic weight it carries. But its central role as the primary carrier of human thought had irrevocably passed. The age of mass communication had dawned, built on a foundation of rag paper, and it would forever change the speed, scale, and very nature of how ideas move through the world. And so the great transition unfolded, not as a sudden extinction, but as a gradual passing of the torch. The practices honed over a millennium of working with parchment, however, refused to fade away. Instead, they seamlessly migrated onto the new medium of paper, forming the very bedrock of modern information science. Consider the meticulous discipline of the monastic archivist. His task was not merely to store scrolls and codices, but to organize them in a way that made specific knowledge retrievable. He developed the first library catalogs, often written on slips of parchment and pasted inside the covers of books, listing their contents and their location on the shelf. He created elaborate indexing systems, using symbols and numbers to create a mental map of the library's holdings. This intellectual architecture, the idea that a collection of texts is useless without a system to navigate it, was Parchment's most enduring gift to the future. The great research libraries of the world, from the Bodleian at Oxford to the Library of Congress, are the direct descendants of those medieval scriptoria and their carefully managed chests of parchment treasures. The very concept of a publicly accessible archive, where historical records are preserved for the benefit of all, is a secularization of the monastic ideal of preserving knowledge for the salvation of souls. This legacy is vibrantly alive in the countless medieval parchments that survive to this day, resting in climate-controlled cases in museums and libraries across the globe. Their physical presence is nothing short of miraculous. We can now hold in our hands the very charter that a Norman king sealed with his own signet ring, or trace the faint lines of a prayer book that a nun clasped in devotion 1,000 years ago. These are not mere artifacts, they are open windows into the minds of the past. For historians, they are an unparalleled resource. A legal document like the Domesday Book is not just a list of properties. It is a detailed X-ray of 11th century English society, revealing patterns of land ownership, agricultural production, and social hierarchy with a precision that no later chronicle can match. The handwritten marginal notes scribbled by a monk in the flyleaf of a manuscript, a complaint about the cold, a recipe for ink, a note about a local scandal offer intimate, unvarnished glimpses of daily life that the official histories deliberately omit. The durability of the material has allowed these voices to whisper across the centuries, ensuring that our understanding of the Middle Ages is not based on speculation, but on a vast and growing body of physical evidence. This has allowed for breathtaking feats of modern reconstruction. Take, for instance, the painstaking work of scholars studying palimpsests. Using advanced multi-spectral imaging, they can now peer beneath the surface of a later text to recover the erased writing underneath. In doing so, they have resurrected works thought lost forever. An unknown speech by the Roman statesman Cicero, a previously unknown translation of the Gospels, even fragments of ancient Greek scientific texts. Each recovered word is a small victory against oblivion, and it is only possible because the underlying parchment was so incredibly resilient. Similarly, the study of hundreds of mundane documents, wills, court rolls, property deeds, has allowed linguists to map the gradual evolution of languages like English and French with astonishing detail. We can watch the great vowel shift happen in real time across centuries of handwritten records, seeing how pronunciations changed by how spellings were adapted. We can trace the introduction of new words from trade and conquest. Parchment has given us a time-lapse video of human communication itself, a record of how we have talked to each other and governed ourselves for over 1,000 years. This enduring physical presence is the ultimate testament to the foresight of the medieval world. They chose a material not for its convenience or its low cost, but for its permanence. They invested immense labor and resources into creating objects that were built to last, because they believed that the words they contained were important enough to speak to generations yet unborn. In our own digital age, where information feels ethereal and infinitely reproducible, we face the opposite problem: digital decay. File formats become obsolete, hard drives fail, websites vanish. The average lifespan of a web page is shockingly short. The medieval commitment to durability challenges our own, often casual relationship with preservation. It asks us what we are doing to ensure that the digital artifacts of our own culture, our emails, our social media posts, our digital photographs, will be accessible to historians 500 years from now. The Parchment Codex, sitting solidly on a shelf, represents a powerful argument for the value of physical, stable, and independent forms of record-keeping. So what do these parchment empires ultimately teach us? They reveal a profound and enduring truth about the nature of power. Military conquest can seize land and subdue populations, but it is inherently fleeting. True, lasting power is the power to shape reality through information, to write the laws, to record the history, to define the truth, and to preserve the culture. The medieval church and state understood this intimately. Their investment in scribes, scriptoria, and archives was not a frivolous luxury. It was the core infrastructure of control. It allowed them to project their authority across time and space, to make their decisions stick, and to ensure that their version of events would be the one that endured. This is why the struggle over who gets to write and what gets written down is one of the oldest and most fundamental conflicts in human history. The Parchment Empires show us that the battle for the future is always, in part, a battle over the memory of the past. They remind us that the most formidable fortresses are not made of stone but of stories, and that the most influential rulers are often not the ones who wield the sword, but the ones who hold the pen. Parchment empires remind us that true power often lies not in force alone, but in the ability to record, transmit, and preserve ideas. From monastic cells to royal chanceries, scrolls and codices shaped medieval society in ways that swords never could, building infrastructures of knowledge that outlasted battles and dynasties. As we navigate our own digital age, the lessons of parchment about the value of durability, the importance of access, and the ethics of production remain strikingly relevant. The quiet patience of the scribe, the deliberate choice of a lasting medium, the immense cost of preserving knowledge, these are not relics of a forgotten past but mirrors held up to our own world. We now face our own version of these ancient challenges, with data stored in clouds that can vanish with a server crash, and information shared at lightning speed but often lost just as quickly. The choices we make today about what to save, how to save it, and who gets to access it will echo for centuries, just as the decisions made in a medieval scriptorium still shape our understanding of history. The struggle between open access and controlled knowledge, between ephemeral trends and enduring truths, continues in every tweet, every digital archive, every encrypted message. Our tools have changed, but the fundamental human questions remain. What stories will we tell future generations? What evidence will we leave behind? The legacy of parchment challenges us to think beyond the immediate moment, to consider the longevity of our digital footprints and the ethical weight of our information ecosystems. It invites us to be not just consumers of content, but thoughtful architects of the future's memory. As we stand at the intersection of the virtual and the tangible, we would do well to remember that the most powerful empires are not always built on conquest, but on the fragile, enduring strength of a shared idea, carefully preserved and passed from one generation